So, inside the Lords this week, there's been a lot of chatter about a number of important issues. Even though the leadership of the SNP isn't of direct interest to the Lords in particular, but certainly Parliament, where the SNP has a very large number of MPs, there's a lot of discussion about who's going to get the job after the shock resignation by Nicola Sturgeon. And the one I want to concentrate on is obviously the chatter around Kate Forbes. Kate Forbes is somebody who ticks all of the SNP boxes and in lots of ways should be a favourite. But as you'll have noticed over the last few days, what's become an issue is a range of media interviews in which she's been put under pressure to discuss her personal, private, religious views in relation to same-sex marriage, even sex before marriage. And then that obviously some public discussion about her position in relation to the Gender Recognition Self-ID Act that was ultimately the downfall for Nicola Sturgeon. So why I was particularly interested in this is because on, I think it was Friday last week or Thursday last week, I was speaking at Exeter University, and Exeter had done a debate on religious freedom, or rather they were talking about whether religion was under attack. And I actually used Kate Forbes as an example to argue that I did think that religious freedom was under attack. And that's a distinction I want to stick with here, which is that it doesn't really make any sense at all to say, oh, you can be whatever religion you want. It doesn't even have to take the form of, as it has done with some people, queuing up to play the victim and say, oh, all Christians are under attack. Isn't it terrible? Woe is me. To note that people who have religious views are under attack for those views, and what those of us who are interested in a secular democracy need to do is defend religious freedom. And I quoted in my speech, and I really want to kind of shout it around Parliament this week, John Locke's an essay on toleration. You know, this is a very old document from the 17th century, but an important one nonetheless. Because what we have here is a document that explains, for the first time, puts forward a philosophical argument that the state should have no jurisdiction whatsoever in what you think or believe, what goes on in your head or what goes on in your heart. And we've held true to that. That has become the basis on which modern free speech, freedom of association, rights that we take for granted was built on that big philosophical breakthrough, because before that, the state actually could tell you what to believe in terms of religion. And so Locke's contribution was very important. But he also had another point which was very important, I think, which was that nobody should be compelled to say what they don't believe. You know, we have a classic historical example of martyrs where, you know, the state says, will you denounce your Christianity or your faith of whatever description? And if not, we'll burn you at the stake, right? That's often how people ended up being martyred. Of course, we don't have anything quite so dramatic now, but you are in a situation where you're asked to renounce your beliefs that you hold in good faith, if you're religious. In the Kate Forbes case, I don't know what they wanted to do. I mean, are they expecting her to say, oh, I go against everything I was reared to believe in the church in order to satisfy the media pack or the kind of demand that she is fashionably up to date with her political views? It seems to me to be an incitement for people to speak in bad faith. And actually, we see it all the time. We saw it with Tim Farron as the head of the Lib Dems when they made that very point to him. You know, do you or do you not think that homosexuality is a sin? He refused to answer. Kate Forbes was a bit braver. And as a consequence, he was forced to leave being the head of the Lib Dems. And the main thing about this is, I don't care. It's not religion I care about. I'm not interested in religion. But we've seen that kind of compelled speech elsewhere. I mean, what else is it if you're asked, told that you have to, for example, use the preferred pronouns of someone? What else is it if you are asked to go on courses in equality, diversity and inclusion and you have to say that you agree with them, otherwise you will be known as a bigot? This freedom of conscience question that comes from freedom of religion is important for us all when it comes to politics. So that's one big issue that's been going on. Another completely unrelated chattering around the parliamentary building and inside the Lords this week has been what on earth is going on with the supposed New Deal that Rishi Sunak is negotiating with the EU in relation to the Northern Irish Protocol. And the main reason why that's been reduced to, gaggles of people standing around on corners speculating as to what it all means is that none of us have seen what's in the deal. And so consequently, it obviously, understandably, fuels a kind of conspiratorial outlook of people saying it might be this, it might be that. Will the DUP be happy? Will the ERG be happy? People saying what they think about a deal that they haven't yet seen. And that obviously is a real weakness when we, as a country, voted to take back control of our laws, and we end up in a situation where here we have the very thing that people really despised and hated, which is secret, behind closed door deals, when no one has a chance to discuss them. Nobody in Parliament who'll be asked to vote for it has yet set eyes on this deal. And yet we know that some people have seen the deal or seen parts of the deal because they keep saying we're very happy with it, like the Southern Irish government, for example. So it's a real problem, I think, that so much is hidden from view, even within Parliament. And on that very question, I've just walked out of, it was something of a pain to walk out of an incredibly annoying discussion on the EU retained law bill. So in that bill, which I wasn't speaking in the debate today, the Lords are going through clause by clause this EU retained law bill. And as I've spoken more broadly before, what this does is it takes the 4,000 pieces of retained EU law and regulation. It basically gives them a sunset clause and says that the government is going to either make them part of UK law or dump them by the end of this year. And this has led to what can only be described as a hysterical reaction from certainly members of the House of Lords and more generally the kind of hardcore Remain camp that has basically said that what's going to happen is that the government are going to dump every possible liberal protection of workers' rights, maternity rights, any positive thing that you can ever think of, and that they're going to use this to really stamp down in an authoritarian way on what rights we are left with. So there's two problems with this. First of all, it makes the assumption that everything that came out of the EU was a positive right that we'd want to retain. Secondly, it underestimates the fact that there have been blockages on dealing with EU retained law precisely by people who've really tried to keep the door open to returning, to rejoining the EU in some form or another, even if it's just through a softer kind of Brexit that will allow us to work in tandem with the European Union. And thirdly, the government have handled it badly. I don't doubt that. I don't think that I think this is, in this instance, a very technical bill, which is just basically forcing themselves almost to get on with it. And I think that's what the public who voted to leave want to happen. But because it, again, has been done with some secrecy, and effectively the bill does give power to the government, to the executive part of the government, not the parliamentary, more democratic side, to make decisions about these laws without us being able to say what we think about it. And that is problematic. But it's such bad faith argument because people arguing it are the people who allowed those 4,000 laws and regulations to be brought in to UK law via our membership of the EU with absolutely no capacity for the public or Parliament to have any say whatsoever on whether we thought they were good, bad or indifferent, to amend them or what have you. So, that's a kind of example of a difficulty when it comes to lawmaking, which is, I think this is a technical amendment, but I have no sympathy with the Remainers using it in a cynical way. But I do understand that when a government is less than transparent on a lot of issues, there's bound to be some cynicism where it fuels that kind of distrust of what they're up to behind closed doors. All of this has not been helped by a bill that I did speak on this week, which is the strikes minimum standards bill. And just to quickly say on that, this is the smallest piece of legislation I've ever had to deal with. It's only 7 pages. And if you just take the headlines, it makes it sound reasonable, but to explain what's happened here. I argued against this bill. What will happen is that the executive, Minister of State, will have the power to make the following decision. It will say to any of the 6 industrial areas or sectors that have been named in the bill, like health, education, railway, nuclear, and so on, during a strike, there has to be minimum standards. It says that the Secretary of State says that to a boss or an employer. Tell us what your minimum standards are. And the boss could say, we need 90% of the railway to work in order for minimum standards to apply, which would obviously make a mockery of the strike. The boss then dictates what those minimum standards are, completely left up to them to do that. They then go to the trade union and say, we need these people to work in order to provide minimum standards in this hospital, in this ambulance service, in this fire service. They name the people, name as individuals people that need to work during the strike. That is going to be the law. Then the union, and this will have to be the law, will have to tell those named individuals that even if they voted for strike, they've got to cross a picket line and do the job, strike break. And if they refuse, they lose their protection at work rights, which will mean that they won't be able to claim unfair dismissal if they're sacked. And not only do they lose those rights, but if the union is not seen to be trying to force their members to cross the picket line in those circumstances, everyone on strike are threatened with losing those rights as well. It is a draconian, terrible piece of legislation. And it doesn't help those of us who are arguing in the EU retained bill that the Tory government are not out to destroy workers' rights through that bill, when in fact their strike bill will do just that. Now, I know a lot of people who are watching this will have little sympathy with trade unions, who after all didn't think much about minimum standards or didn't think much about when they were calling for lockdowns and so on. People find it galling that a lot of civil servants are still working from home. All of these things, I understand that. Only 23% of the population are unionised. But a warning, if we allow a precedent for the government to dictate that how we work and the way that we work and self-organisation at work is to be smashed so glibly, and what's more is in a bill that's so small that it doesn't mention any detail, simply gives powers to the minister of the day to make those decisions, then all of our rights are threatened. And I had a go at the government perfectly reasonably to say if they really cared about minimum services, they might not have closed down society during lockdown. They might actually hold the employers to account for the fact that the trains don't run on time. You can barely tell the difference between a strike day and a non-strike day and so on. But nonetheless, I'd ask you to look at what the government are doing there and not assume that this is the government simply trying to deal with unruly strikes, because they're going much further in terms of an attack on our freedoms. And then the final thing, I had a very busy day yesterday. I spent all day talking about housing, and it was quite funny because the government in their Levelling Up bill have got these 12 missions, and they're kind of very vague about what the missions are. They haven't even printed the missions in the bill, but they've said they're going to fulfil them anyway. So it was a very funny morning of lots of people saying, I want my mission, my favourite mission should be this, my favourite. I used their housing mission that they printed last year as a basis of saying, well, if you're going to have a housing mission, could you at least mention building houses? Because they've managed to have a housing mission that does not involve building any new houses. And consequently, I did a speech on that. You can see it on social media, arguing that we should get rid of all the barriers to ensuring that we build what we need, which is, at least 300,000 houses a year. And every political party makes excuses for not doing so. And there's a particular excuse used around environmentalism, and there's NIMBYism, and there's the Green Belt and so on. But anyway, look at my speech on that. And then I also weighed in the afternoon or early evening on leasehold, which I think is a terrible con, because people who own their homes, very often they actually are just leasing their homes as leaseholders. And leaseholders at the moment are really suffering with excessive service charges, all sorts of rip-offs when it comes to insurance, because basically you don't get to make those decisions. A lot of the time it's your freehold owner of the buildings or the block that you live in. So I kind of weighed in. And in both those instances, the Labour Party were quite supportive, less on the Green Belt stuff. But they were, I've had a week where usually I've been on the side of the Labour Party on the union stuff, and on the side of the Labour Party when it came to talking about housing and leasehold. What's absolutely fascinating, though, And by the way, they find that kind of completely, they can't understand it. And then today, I was like heckling them on the EU retained law bill. So I try and be principled at least and just argue what I think. But what's interesting is that this morning, what happens? Keir Stardy brings out 5 missions. I mean, it's so unimaginative, isn't it? You know, the government have got a levelling up bill with 12 missions. He said, these are the Labour Party's 5 missions. 5 top priorities of this country. And guess what? He doesn't mention housing. So for all of the bluster yesterday when the Labour Party were having a go at the Conservative government for not dealing with housing, and so was I, the Labour Party's 5 missions have managed to ignore housing as well, which will just show you that there's no such thing as trusting any of the political parties on these things, that you have to argue what you believe and get on with it. So I hope you found that interesting. Earlier in the week, we put out a Substack in relation to the strikes issue with a commentary by Gareth Sturdy, who's in the Academy of Ideas Education Forum as an educator. And it's interesting about the attitudes of teachers going on strike, because there's a real split amongst Academy of Ideas. Teachers, they can't decide whether they're for or against them. They're actually quite resistant to close down education for young people after they've been so badly treated during the lockdown period. So it's quite an argument to be had there. And just so you know, and I'll put details in the Substack, there's a meeting that the Education Forum are having, I think it's next Tuesday, on this very question, which should be fascinating to hear both sides of the argument. So if you've got strong views on either education and or on strikes, then do go along to that meeting. And I'll report back next week.